The Epstein files go global, and the walls start closing in. There's a familiar pattern whenever the Epstein story resurfaces. A flood of documents drops, powerful names scramble, lawyers issue denials, officials insist once again that nothing criminal happened, and victims are quietly told, sometimes explicitly, that closure is not coming. But this time, something feels different, because the fallout from the Epstein files is no longer contained within American politics or elite Manhattan courtrooms. It has crossed the Atlantic. And in the United Kingdom, it has detonated inside the very institutions meant to symbolize honor, discretion, and moral authority. Let's start with the headline that should be far bigger than it is. Britain's former ambassador to the United States, Lord Peter Mandelson, is resigning from the House of Lords, not quietly, not ceremonially, but under the shadow of a criminal investigation tied directly to Jeffrey Epstein. This isn't gossip, this isn't rumor. This is the first active criminal probe to emerge from the latest Epstein document release. And it's a bombshell. Mandelson, a towering figure in British politics and a close ally of former Prime Minister Gordon Brown, has long been seen as a consummate insider, someone who navigated power with ease on both sides of the Atlantic. But newly revealed correspondence between Mandelson and Epstein suggests something far more disturbing than social proximity. Investigators are now examining whether Mandelson, while serving as business secretary, leaked market-sensitive government information to Epstein, information that could have been exploited for profit. That allegation alone would be explosive. Combined with Epstein's criminal history and financial mystery, it becomes radioactive. Within hours of Mandelson's resignation announcement, the British government took an almost unheard-of step. The Prime Minister introduced legislation to strip him of his title. Not his seat, that's already gone, but his honorific status itself. That's not political theater, that's damage control. And then came the final shoe dropping. British police confirmed they are investigating him criminally. This is the first real legal consequence we've seen tied to this document release. And it didn't happen in the United States. That fact should make Americans deeply uncomfortable. Because while the UK is moving, slowly, cautiously, but decisively, the United States appears to be doing the opposite, minimizing, narrowing, and preparing the public for disappointment. Nowhere is that contrast more glaring than in how the Epstein files are colliding with the British royal family. Prince Andrew, long the most notorious royal associated with Epstein, was already stripped of his titles and public duties. His televised denials and disastrous interview did lasting damage to the monarchy. But now, something new has happened. A royal has broken ranks. Prince Edward, Andrew's younger brother, didn't mention Andrew by name, but he didn't have to. Speaking to CNN at an education summit, Edward dismissed attempts to deflect attention from Epstein by saying something quietly devastating. It's always important to remember the victims and who the victims are in all this. That may sound measured, but in royal language, it's a rebuke. For years, the palace strategy has been silence, distance, and legal containment. Edward's comments signal something else entirely, an acknowledgement that the story isn't about embarrassment or reputational harm. It's about victims whose suffering has never been fully addressed. And then came the images. One newly released photograph shows Prince Andrew sitting on the floor with an unidentified female, described cautiously as a woman or a girl. The photo does not, on its face, prove criminal behavior. That point matters, but context matters more. When images like this surface after Epstein's conviction, after widespread reporting about trafficking, and after years of denials, they raise questions that simply do not go away. Questions about judgment, about proximity, about what powerful people thought they could get away with. And those questions aren't limited to Andrew. Sarah Ferguson, Andrew's ex-wife and longtime associate, also appears extensively in the files. Correspondence reveals her financial desperation, including messages asking Epstein for money to cover basic expenses like rent. This was not a casual acquaintance. This was a relationship far deeper than previously acknowledged. The picture forming in the UK is one of entanglement, financial, social, and political. Meanwhile, back in Washington, a very different story is being told. Former President Bill Clinton and former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton have reached an agreement with the House Oversight Committee to testify about Epstein, but only under specific conditions. They want to avoid a contempt vote, and they want their testimony to be public. On paper, that sounds like transparency. In practice, it raises new questions. Bill Clinton has never been charged or formally accused of wrongdoing related to Epstein. His spokesman maintains that Clinton was unaware of Epstein's crimes and cut off contact before they became public. But investigative reporters, including those who have covered Epstein for years, say something troubling. The Clintons have never been questioned by law enforcement, not once. And that brings us to the most jarring moment in this entire saga. The Deputy Attorney General of the United States has now publicly stated, again, that there will likely be no further criminal charges stemming from the Epstein files. His reasoning? It is not a crime to party with Mr. Epstein. It is not a crime to email with Mr. Epstein. Legally, that is true. Morally, it is grotesquely insufficient. Because as investigative journalist Sarah Fitzpatrick points out, this framing ignores the most obvious question of all. Why would anyone continue socializing with, traveling with, or seeking favors from Epstein after he was a convicted sex offender? That's not just a moral question, it's an investigative one. If Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell were trafficking victims across state and international lines, and courts have ruled that they were, then anyone in their orbit had potential material knowledge. Who was present, who communicated, who helped facilitate logistics, who turned a blind eye. Those are not trivial details. They are the backbone of trafficking investigations. And yet, despite the Justice Department dedicating enormous resources, hundreds of attorneys, overtime reviews, months of preparation, the public is now being told not to expect accountability. That contradiction is impossible to ignore. If there were never going to be charges, why the massive deployment of manpower? Why pull resources away from other violent crimes? Why raise expectations at all? The answer many survivors fear is the simplest one. This was never about justice. And as the Epstein files continue to ripple outward, from British lords to royal siblings to former presidents, the real question becomes impossible to dodge. Why does accountability seem to stop precisely where power begins? No charges, no answers, and the system that protects power. If segment 1 was about the shockwaves, segment 2 is about the silence that follows them. Because once you strip away the headlines, the resignations, and the carefully worded denials, you're left staring at something far more disturbing than any single name in the Epstein files, a justice system that appears structurally uninterested in finishing the job. Let's start with the Department of Justice, because that's where the story collapses under its own weight. The Deputy Attorney General says it plainly, almost casually. It's not a crime to party with Jeffrey Epstein. It's not a crime to email him. And technically, legally, that's true, but that statement isn't an explanation. It's an escape hatch. Because Epstein wasn't just a bad guy people partied with. He was a convicted sex offender, later charged, along with Ghislaine Maxwell, with sex trafficking. Trafficking is not a vague or symbolic crime. It requires movement, coordination, communication, facilitation, and silence. It requires a network, and networks don't function in a vacuum. This is where investigative reporters and survivors alike say the DOJ's posture becomes impossible to defend. Sarah Fitzpatrick of The Atlantic puts it bluntly, if the government truly believed no further charges were likely, then why did it mobilize hundreds of attorneys? Why did it pull resources away from other violent crimes? Why did it spend months preparing for a document release only to claim at the end of it all that there's nothing more to see? That's not incompetence, that's contradiction. You don't launch a massive review effort unless you expect outcomes, or unless the effort itself is the outcome. A performance of seriousness without the burden of consequences. And that's exactly how survivors are reading it. For them, this isn't about whether every powerful person who crossed Epstein's path committed a prosecutable crime. It's about whether the system ever intended to follow the evidence wherever it led, even if it led to people with political power, cultural influence, or institutional protection. So far, the answer looks like no. Take the Clintons. Bill Clinton is scheduled to testify before the House Oversight Committee alongside Hillary Clinton under a negotiated agreement designed to avoid a contempt vote. They've requested that the testimony be public, which on its face sounds like transparency. But here's the detail that should stop you cold. According to sources familiar with the investigation, neither Bill nor Hillary Clinton has ever been questioned by law enforcement about Epstein. Not once. That doesn't mean guilt, but it absolutely signals reluctance. Because Epstein wasn't charged with petty crimes. He was charged with trafficking minors. Anyone who traveled with him, attended his gatherings, or maintained close contact had potential insight into how his operation functioned, who else was present, how travel was arranged, who was introduced to whom, what happened behind closed doors. That information matters. even if the person providing it committed no crime themselves. In any ordinary trafficking case, investigators would be relentless about mapping the network. Here, the approach appears to be selective restraint, and that selective restraint is exactly what survivors are furious about. Nowhere is that anger more visible than in the backlash over the redacted, or rather insufficiently redacted, files. Victims' attorneys are now openly criticizing the DOJ for releasing documents containing deeply personal information about survivors, names, identifying details, private histories, without adequate protections. This wasn't transparency, it was exposure. After months of preparation, after endless assurances that care would be taken, the release was described by multiple legal observers as haphazard, sloppy, rushed. A hearing is now scheduled in New York, where a judge will hear arguments from victims' lawyers and the government about what should happen next. Some are calling for restrictions or partial withdrawal of materials. Others argue it's already too late, that once information is public, it cannot be meaningfully recontained. And that's the cruel irony. The government managed to protect powerful people from legal scrutiny while failing to protect victims from further harm. That asymmetry is the story. What's especially striking is that this pattern isn't limited to one administration. Fitzpatrick points out that the Epstein investigation has been mishandled across multiple administrations, Democratic and Republican, at both the federal and local levels. That continuity matters. It suggests the problem isn't ideology, it's structure. When Epstein was first arrested years ago, he received an almost unimaginable sweetheart deal. When he was arrested again, he died in federal custody under circumstances that still defy public confidence. When Maxwell was prosecuted, the focus narrowed dramatically. And now, with the largest document release yet, the message appears to be, this is as far as it goes. But survivors, and a growing number of lawmakers, are asking the question no one in power seems eager to answer. Why? Why is there so little appetite to explore how Epstein made his money? Why are there no serious efforts to untangle the financial mechanisms that sustained his lifestyle? Why has there been so little curiosity about how a convicted sex offender maintained access to political leaders, royalty, billionaires, and institutions long after his crimes were known? The released emails offer one chilling clue. Epstein spent his days cultivating relationships, carefully, deliberately. He emailed constantly. He positioned himself as a connector, a fixer, a man who could open doors. That didn't happen by accident. It happened because people kept responding. And yet the DOJ's public posture treats that entire ecosystem as legally irrelevant unless a crime can be proven beyond a narrow threshold. That's not how justice is supposed to work. That's how risk management works. Compare that to the UK response. A former ambassador resigns. Police open an investigation. The government moves to strip honors. Is it perfect? No. Is it complete? Not even close. But it signals something the U.S. response lacks: institutional discomfort. In America, the discomfort seems to be reserved for the public, and that's why this moment matters. Because the Epstein files are no longer just about Epstein. They're about whether modern democracies are capable of holding elite networks accountable when those networks span politics, finance, media, and monarchy. They're about whether victims matter more than reputations. They're about whether justice systems exist to uncover truth or to manage fallout as the documents continue to surface, as hearings loom, and as officials lower expectations in advance. The public is being asked, once again, to accept ambiguity where clarity is owed. But this time, the question is louder than ever. If no one is ever held responsible beyond the most disposable figures, what exactly was all of this for? And who, in the end, is the system really protecting?